thank you. It's an honor to be here to share some of my research work with you and talk about the Arctic, which is one of my favorite places. And I have many friends here, and it's so great to see a lot of familiar faces here. So I'd like to talk to you about what's kind of driven me crazy, but with a lot of joy over the last literally 15 to 17 years. This is a project that I started. I date it by the fact that my younger son was 2 years old when I started this project, and he's 19 years old now. So just a little bit of a word of explanation for, or at least encouragement to you graduate students. If you've got a really good idea, don't give up. It's worth pursuing something that even seems very difficult. In my years of research in the Arctic, I've had the pleasure of going to a lot of different places in the Arctic. My interests have been in understanding the climate history of the Arctic on many time scales. My master's work was in Baffin Island, working on marine and glacial marine sediments of the last few glacial cycles. And then I moved to Alaska, where I was working on the sea level history of the northern parts of Beringia. And everywhere I went, I was working on sections of sediments here and sediments there, but never had the full picture of the entire history of the Arctic all in one location. I was trying to piece together bits of information from different locations. What was the Arctic like in the past? What is happening in the past that could inform us about the directions that we're going in now? And I became fascinated with the Bering Land Bridge because of the fact that it's such an interesting bottleneck for the Arctic. It's certainly the gateway. Sometimes some people call it the back door to the Arctic. I could like to think of it as a front door. But in fact, this is the main way that the Pacific Ocean communicates with the Atlantic Ocean via the Arctic during times of high sea level. And then during times of low sea level, it's blocked, and it becomes a bridge for the migration of plants and animals, and ultimately humans, between Asia and North America. So it's this interesting bottleneck that is sometimes open, sometimes closed, and with that comes in wonderful changes in geography and continentality that impact the climate of this region. So in my work with Russian colleagues starting in 1990, I learned about this amazing lake basin. Olga Glushkova from Magadan Nesri Institute showed me a picture of Elgagikin one afternoon in 1994. And she said, "Julie, we should core this lake." And I said, "Sure, let me find some money to do it." And the more I learned about this lake, the more fascinated I became by it. It was formed in the Middle Pliocene. For those of you not familiar with geologic time periods, if we go back about 3.6 million years ago, the Arctic was very warm. In fact, the Antarctic was kind of warm too. But the world was relatively warm, and the Arctic was forested. We didn't have a Greenland ice sheet like we have today, but we had forests, even as high as up to the northern coast of Ellesmere Island. We had 5 different kinds of pine right up to the Arctic coast. We didn't have sea ice at that time. And our best estimates for the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at this time is not well known, but the best estimates by Mark Pagani and others are that we were at about 400 parts per mil, or very similar to where we are today. So looking back as far back as 3.6 million years ago could perhaps inform us of some of the changes that may be in store as we continue to warm the Earth. So this artistic rendition of what the landscape may have been like is not too far from what we imagine. So Lake Elgagikin is positioned here on the crest of the Anadyr Mountains in northeast Chukotka. It occurs in an area right smack dab in the middle of an area that was not glaciated ever. So it never had large continental ice sheets there. Areas to the west and to the east did receive glaciation and were glaciated, and there's good geomorphology to show that. But this area was never glaciated. So we had potentially this beautiful bowl that's been in place for 3.6 million years, accumulating sediments and organic matter and fossils of various kinds to tell us about the regional climate of the Arctic all in one place. It was a dream come true. I could take all of these places that I'd studied across the Arctic and collate them into one record in one place. So I was very motivated to go there and study this region. And also, here's this lake. It's positioned here, and it's right smack dab near the largest area of the Arctic that's losing the sea ice the most. So it's really sensitive to what's happening in terms of Arctic climate change. So the idea of getting a lake core where we could look at and reconstruct the climate of the past in an area that was otherwise relative, where we knew very, very little in terms of what the history of the Arctic was like. So how do we pull off a project like this? First of all, you've got to get some good colleagues. Nobody likes to work with people they don't like, right? So you had to find good colleagues, and we were successful in doing this. And I want to acknowledge my co-conspirators here, Martin Mellis from the University of Cologne, and Pavel Minuk from the Magadan Nesri Institute. The three of us are essentially the country chief scientists for this project, and we collaborated over 15 years to really pull this off. This project involved 3 site surveys, and no kidding, the first year I went over there, I went across with $70,000 wrapped around my waist. I'm not joking. And I had to have numbered bills unwrinkled. So they brought in a Brinks truck to the 5 College Credit Union in Amherst and gave me this money in a back room. I put it into a waist belt and walked off with my fleece to Russia. So this involved a bit of risk. I always felt like I had a bullseye on my forehead when I went over there. Lots of meetings in Moscow, lots of vodka. I've acquired a taste for vodka, I must say. That's kind of required. So it's a lot of work and a lot of fun doing the pre-site survey work to go to a very remote place, which, no kidding, is roadless. This is, it's 250, 300 kilometers from the nearest airport, let alone the nearest road. So while we tried to go from Anchorage to Magadan and Pivik a few times, we often had to go through Moscow. So getting there was often relatively difficult and sometimes risky. Piling everything we had into a sleazy cargo plane packed in with not nice Zargos boxes, but cheap Rubbermaid containers from Lowe's. And then stopping along the way at airports to refuel just because the Russians said we needed to, but I'm not sure we needed to. And just running into a lot of adversary situations. For example, in 2000, we set up a meteorological station at the lake like this. One of these standard Campbell Met stations was set up by Matt Nolan from University of Alaska. It was set up, and 3 days later we left the camp. We found out that at the time, the mayor of Pivik, the nearby village, wanted one of our Zodiacs, one of our outboard motors and a Zodiac. He wanted it so bad that he really, he just really had to have it. We wouldn't give it to him, and so a couple days later, he shot a bullet hole right through the data logger in our Met station. So anyway, we had to go back and fix that, and so the next year, I actually flew back in 2001, and I had to rewire this thing. And I'd never done that before, and so I had to take apart the data logger and rewire that in a matter of about 3 hours before we had bad weather and I had to get out of there. So, for a moment, I really, it operated for 8 years after that on a solar panel. So there must have been some divine intervention there, because I'm not sure I could have pulled that off again. But it's a beautiful place. Lake Ogagikin is not, it's one of these places where I camped for 10 weeks straight in the same place doing field work, and I just never got tired of looking at this landscape. It's absolutely beautiful. The lake itself is 12 kilometers across. The basin is 18 kilometers across. And it's just a fascinating and beautiful place. But it is in the middle of nowhere. So how do we get a drill rig that we're building in Salt Lake City and get it all the way to Russia in a place where there aren't any roads? Well, nothing's impossible. If we want to do it, we're going to do it. So we managed to figure out a way to pull this off. And so after much haggling with eventually getting enough funding to do the project, we initially started out by in 2008, having to set up first in the summer a field camp with Russian contractors who set up this small town on the edge of the lake where we could house 40 people, drill crews, and staff to take care of all of us while we were out there. Just for reference, here's one outhouse at this end and one outhouse at this end. And there's a mess area in the front and then an office in the center. And we had a nice banya here where you could wash and take a bath. So then we had to get the drill rig, of course, across the Atlantic, through Bering Straits and up into Pivik here. We actually had 15 containers that came across the Pacific, and then 2 more from Germany that came across the Trans-Siberian Railroad. They met, and 1 week later, this stuff went up through the Bering Straits on the last ship going up to the north. So we were able to get that stuff in there, and then the last legs were taken by truck. And I just want to show you, this really is rather roadless. Here's Pivik, and we had to get the 300 kilometers to the lake, which is here. And what this involved was waiting. This is actually, if you can barely see, there's a road there. This road is maintained after January by the Copal gold mine here. Kinross operates a gold mine there. And so they operate a road system once it freezes over that goes all the way through here. So our trucks came across to this, across to here, and then they were pulled literally by bulldozer through the snow the last 90 kilometers. 90 kilometers. So this was a magic point. Lots of stuff got stuck at 90 kilometers from the lake. And this involved, of course, putting 100 tons of drill rig out on the lake meant we didn't want it to fall through the ice in the wintertime. So we had to thicken up the ice out here with by flooding it. So the snow was cleared off by Russian bulldozers, and then the pumps were brought out to flood the ice and thicken it. We thickened it within a matter of weeks to 2 meters, which was more than enough to carry this through. And I want to mention the tarp and the tent cover here that was put on the top of the drill rig was tested at minus 80 degrees in Krell, as far as I know. I think they bashed it in a freezer for a while is while they tested it. But in other ways, we knew that the stitching wasn't going to fall apart, although we did have trouble with power cords at minus 50 don't last very long if you've ever done that. The camp was set up. So we had the camp over here on the edge of the lake, and then we had a road 7 kilometers that came out to the drill site, and we distributed the weight of the drill pipe and so on around the pad, and we even had a rescue hut out here. In case something did happen here, we had a place to go in bad weather. So that's a little bit of how we did that, and it was a success ultimately. I could probably write a small book on a lot of the different issues that happened during the lake and at the lake, and all of the challenges that we had along the way working in another country, and how we can import and export materials in that sense. So that's a conversation over a beer or a glass of wine I'm happy to have with any of you. But anyway, this whole group was we worked reasonably well together, and under this situation, this is both the night crew and the day crew both together here. Actually, Martin Mellis and I traded off times in the field, so he took the front 2 months, and I took the last 2 months of the field season, so he's photoshopped in over here on this picture. Nobody can tell. Okay, so why do we want to do this? What is it about this lake that's so important? Well, one thing is we don't really understand what the climate history of the Arctic really is over time. We have pieces of information we really don't know. And so we have a record like this. For those of you who are familiar with this, you'll recognize this is a composite record from the oceans. If you could take the climate record of the Indian Ocean, the Pacific, the Atlantic, put it into one diagram. This is a Rosetta Stone, so we say, of climate history that goes back to 5 million years here up to the present here. And these wiggles here tell you something relative about temperature. So if you, and this is a measure of changes in the oxygen isotope level of fossils, marine fossils that live in the bottom of the ocean, where it should be relatively stable. But ignoring that for a minute, if you just think that up is warm and down is cold, that's all the information you need. So we can see that over from the last 5 million years, we go through these warm and cold, and we see that they change in amplitude and they get more wild over the last more recent time. This is a composite from the ocean. But would the Arctic look the same? Is the history of the Arctic the same? How did the changes in the Arctic correspond to some of these changes? And we want to know this because it's like you think about the Earth as a system that we want to understand. We each understand our own bodies like a system. We know that when we have a head cold, what will happen during that head cold? We've had head colds before. We know how they run their course. We know we have times of fever and chills, and we know what we need to do to correct that. And what we want to do is understand the Earth system kind of the same way. We want to know how does it change and what causes these changes back and forth. So we're really interested in looking at how this operates, and particularly the role of carbon dioxide in this story. As many of you know, we have a record from the ice cores. This is the Epoca ice core from Antarctica, where there's fossil air trapped in the ice that tells us something about the carbon dioxide level. And of course, today, and we have, well, if we go back 800,000 years to the present, we can see there's warm times, cold times, warm times, cold times, like this. And then we can also see, if we measure the CO2 in the fossil air, we can say something about the atmosphere. And we can see that we can go from kind of this range of roughly about 180 parts per mil to 280 parts per mil, back and forth through time. But of course now, we are way up here, approaching 400 parts per mil. Something like we last saw in the Middle Pliocene at about 3.6 million years ago, roughly in that time period. So we are so way outside of the envelope, and what kind of the world was that in the past? So that's what we're thinking about. I like to tell people, everybody seems to know their cholesterol number. So those of you who are in grad school, just remember, just try to remember the carbon dioxide level of the atmosphere today, and then what is the carbon dioxide level of the atmosphere when you graduate, when you get your degree. And you'll get a sense of how fast it's really changing. So how do I study the Arctic? One of the, and particularly Arctic climate sediments, what we had to do was do a pre-site survey work where we really understood the chemistry of this lake. Because every lake is like a person. They all have their own different personalities. The chemistry is different. The stratification is different. So we need to understand how that operates. Then we can take sediment cores like this and look back in time and extract the fossil organic matter and the fossils themselves and look at the stratigraphy to say something about climate change. So we tend to produce these climate wiggles that tell us about warm and cold times in the past. And so this is more or less how we approach it. And this is Martin Mellis and Pavel Manuk here to tell us about that. So we have this Arctic that looks like this today. We have a Greenland ice sheet that looks like this, but what happened in the past? Is it possible the Greenland ice sheet looked like this in the past? What can we say about that? I'm on the other side of the Arctic. So what can we actually say about, in terms of the Arctic history, about may have been the history of Greenland, but also about the Arctic in general. And what we want to know is, how did this region change, going from trees to not so many trees to a tundra landscape? How did we operate through these warm periods in the Arctic when we had trees all the way to the Arctic coast, to times when we have just tundra like this in the past? And then in between, what were the intermediate conditions like that? And so what we want to do is then go back in time and see how the system operated. People who do paleoclimate research, we like to think of ourselves like time lords. You guys know Doctor Who? Okay, like Doctor Who, we can go backwards and forwards in time using the geologic record to try to look and see. We maybe can't change the course of history, but we can certainly understand that. So we like to think about going back in time in the sediments to understand what happened in the past. Now, what we developed early on, this is the first core we got out here, and literally we had no knowledge of this lake basin. We literally flew to the center, or almost the center, on a helicopter, had a GPS, went just land there. And it turned out to be the perfect spot that had the most continuous record, uninterrupted by any kind of debris flows around the edge of the lake. And I just want to show you a couple of things. For example, ignore all this. If you just look at the orange and green here, each of these orange spots here are warm times. These are the pollen extracted from trees. So we know that there were more trees around the landscape during these time periods. This goes back, this is the last 10,000 years, this is 120,000 years ago, this is 210,000 years ago, and this is 300. So we have an idea of, we can go back in time and look at the general vegetation and look at these different periods. And this is just an example of how we use these wiggles, how we understand it. We want to look at, for this is like betula, allness, pine, and these are some other indices of change. And you can go from, for example, this is about 10,000 years of time. And what we can do with this is take a look at how these changes came over time. For example, first the betula comes in, then the allness comes in, and then the pine comes in. So we can look at the phasing of how the ecosystem was adapting to this particular climate event, this warming event that was a brief period, about, in this case, a little over 200,000 or 300,000 years ago. So this kind of visualization is really helpful to think these wiggles that I might show you are related to real vegetation that we're trying to map over time. So what we have here, this is our what we extracted during our field campaign in 2008, 2009. It took a little bit of, in the fall of 2008, we extracted 140 meters of permafrost into the alluvial fan deposits here, where we were hoping to be able to understand some information about the permafrost history of this region. And then in the spring, starting more or less in February until the first part of May, we then extracted 3 cores, A, B, and C. They're exaggerated, not to scale here, but basically right next to each other to extract a continuous record through the Quaternary back to 2.6 million years old, and then back to 3.6 million into the base of the sediment fill. Then we also went 200 meters into the impact breccia down below, and that 200 meters of impact breccia is being studied by planetary scientists who are interested in the impact process. And so I won't be talking about that, but if you're interested in that part, I can give you some references and contact information for the separate set of studies going on with that. So from that, we extract, as Time Lords, as I say, the first thing we want to do is extract the overall general record. And so what we do is we use these automatic modern scanning devices, geotech scanning devices, to get a number of parameters to very quickly tell us something about what's in the cores. And this is just a lot of wiggles. That's all I want you to get out of that. I'm not expecting you to get anything more than there's a lot of wiggles here. Some of the colors here I'm going to use again in more detail, but just to give you an idea, there's things that are grain size, the color, the amount of biogenic silica, the ratios of silica to titanium, which can tell us sometimes about productivity, organic matter, and also then how that relates to changes in insulation from the upper atmosphere with climate change. So there's a number of parameters, and then we use this data to guide our studies and do more detailed work. So if we look at the whole composite record here, this is how geologists look. We look for changes in the Earth's magnetic field from normal to reversed to set up our paleomagnetic time scale. So this is the top of the core here, going back to about 2.6 million here, and this is about 3.6 million years here. And you can see that we have, this is depth versus age, and we can see that we have a lower sedimentation rate, 5 centimeters per 1,000 years, pretty low, kind of like the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And then going back in time, it got faster. When the landscape was newer, probably more relief, we had probably wetter, as I'll make a case for in a minute. We had a higher sedimentation rates in the past. What do these sediments look like? They're beautiful. Maybe I'm just a nerdy geologist, but these are gorgeous. And they were beautifully collected by the Dosick Drilling Company. And we can identify these 5 or 6 different facies here, from things that are very well laminated to things that just have changes in color. Again, red laminations versus gray laminations. They're really delightful to work with. And it's amazing how color even is important. And I wanted to show you a really bizarre thing that we've discovered early on in the studies, is that we now have these color spectrometers that measure color reflectance in a scanning world. And they give you an index, for example, of hue. Some of you have used a Munsell color chart. You know what I'm talking about. The hue, the overall color. And this is from 700,000 to 1.8 million years ago here. And you can see the up and down means warm, cold, they actually correspond to that. The blue here is a section from that marine composite record, what we call the LR stack, from the same time period. And what you can see that there's a lot of correspondence between the wiggles from the ocean and what we're seeing in just color from our lake record. So I have a student, Jeremy Way, who's doing a master's thesis on extracting what's driving color. What is it in the sedimentology with the clay mineralogy, the pigments, the organic matter, to see exactly what is controlling, how is color related to some kind of climate parameter. So there's all sorts of things that we can experiment with in terms of understanding the record here. So let me take you to a couple of spots in the record to just highlight particularly what we're learning about how warm the Arctic got in the past, how warm it's been. So I want to start out, here is this record now, the marine holy grail here, the Lasecki-Ramo curve from 3.6 million up to the present. And again, low frequency cold, warm cycles here, and then larger frequency here. So we're going to take a look now in detail at this last 600,000 years. So this pink area is expanded here from 0 to 600,000 years ago. And what I want to show you here is, here's color, and each of these warm tops, these orange colored tops are the warm periods. When it's down here, it's cold. These are the glaciations. These are the warm interglacials. And we have a number of parameters that line up here. So we're going to take a look at one in particular. Now, let me preface right now, if we think of ourselves as Time Lords, how far back do we know anything about the Arctic? Well, the Greenland ice sheet has a nice stratigraphic record in the ice that goes back about 100,000 years. Below that, it gets a bit messy. Mary can qualify that. Gets a little messy below that. So let's call it 100,000 years. And if we go deeper than that or older than that, it gets a little spotty. There's a little here, a little there. So most of what we know, we have some records of 125,000 years ago, what we call the last interglacial, the last time it was a little warmer than present. But prior to that, we really didn't know anything in any detail, very spotty information. So what we're going to take a look at here is this period we call Isotope Stage 11. MIS stands for Marine Isotope Stage. This is simply a numbering system that geologists use to talk about time. The warm periods are all odd numbers. The cold periods are even numbers. So it's not too complicated that way. So we'll talk about Isotope Stage 11. What do we know about that? Well, this was an amazing revelation that our group first learned when we started opening the cores and processing the data. So here's the whole record, and if you just go right there in that spot and expand it out. So here's several meter record here, and this goes from 450,000 to 380,000 years ago. So what we see here is this curve here through this time shows you the change in temperature in Antarctica, Dome C. So it's an ice core record. You see it here going like that. This is the biogenic silica record from Lake Baikal. You know where that is. That's in Asia. And here is the biogenic silica record from Lake Elgagikyan. And what we were astonished is that they look so similar. These are totally different places on the planet. In fact, even little events like that in Antarctica are recorded in Lake Baikal and Lake Elgagikyan. And so it immediately confirmed what we thought we already knew, but it emphasized this is a lake that's not just a lake in Russia. It's collecting a global signal of climate change. And that was really very rewarding for us. If we look at the pollen, and those of you know if you collect the pollen, you can reconstruct what the vegetation was like around the lake basin. And again, we've simplified the pollen diagram. Here, the pink is trees and shrubs. The green is herbs. And then we have spores here. And the main thing I want you to see is that in stage 11, we had a lot of trees, a lot of tree pollen. And in fact, if we look in detail at the pollen and then reconstruct from using a biomodel, what we do is, what the paleoecologists do is they take the assemblage of plants and reconstruct the best estimate of the mean temperature of the warmest month, July, because that controls the distribution of trees in the Arctic. And we can also estimate the precipitation, the annual precipitation. So those are the two parameters I tell you. The mean temperature of the warmest month, which is July, and the precipitation. What you can see here, the green line through the record from 450 to 380 is in fact, the green line is today at about 7 degrees in summer. But back in stage 11, temperatures were as warm as 10 to 15 degrees, much warmer than present back during this time. Nobody had ever seen this before. This was the first time anybody realized that stage 11, in fact, was so much warmer in this part of the Arctic. So let's take another look at another time period, the same diagram. Now we're shifting back to about 1 million years. And here's the same sets of wiggles. And now we're going to look at just stage 31 right here. And we want to see what that period is like. And I'll tell you in a minute why we looked at stage 31. This is back at around 1.1 million years in time. And again, the same record looking only in detail at that. What we could see here, in fact, that here's today's temperature in green from 1.1 to about 1.05 here in time, about 1 million years ago. And then what we can see that the temperatures are estimated to have been about 6 degrees warmer than present in July. And so again, that was pretty amazing. How do we get to such a warmer world? Well, we could think about carbon dioxide, and there have been some, this is out of Lamont, has been published some estimates of, this is from 0 to 2 million years ago, some estimates of what carbon dioxide may have been like in the past. She estimates maybe around 300 parts per mil, not remarkably high. But it turns out that also, due to the orbital changes, the shape in the Earth's orbit around the sun, and also the tilt and so on, it turns out we had a really, parameters that were enhanced to increase insolation in the, at this time period. So if we look, this is the marine stack here. These wiggles are just those changes in orbits. So don't worry about understanding exactly what those are. Other than this, they see the reds and the blues go like this. That's because the signal gets opposite in the Antarctic and the Arctic. Okay, so when it's warm in the Antarctic, it gets warm later in the Arctic here. So they're slightly out of phase because of the Earth's tilt. Right? Don't worry about those wiggles too much. So suddenly, we had a link with Antarctica. And it turned out that in 2 years before we drilled our project, our site, the Andrill project was drilling underneath the Ross Ice Shelf to look at the history of Antarctica, to look at the history there. And what they found was, in fact, that in Isotope Stage 31, the exact same time period, the West Antarctic ice sheet was gone. It didn't exist. So here we had evidence for no West Antarctic ice sheet, and then half a precession cycle later, extreme warmth in the Arctic. So we had this direct connection in time between these two projects. Thanks, Dan. That's up. I have to stick that in there. And happily I do that, I should say. So the Andrill group, they put together these beautiful cartoons that tell us about what happened down there during this time. So when you get diatomaceous ooze deposited, there is no West Antarctic ice sheet. There's only open water. And then when the ice shelf advances out and we get glaciation, we get glacial tills. So they can easily see diatomaceous ooze tills, and they can tell whether or not the West Antarctic ice sheet existed in the past. And so here we have this amazing link to here in stage 31, this is their composite record, and that yellow area right there is sediment that is diatomaceous ooze of stage 31 that we could relate to our record. So I just want to go a little further now with the Lake E record. Whoa. Oh, for heaven's sakes. I don't know what that's about. Coming back? I have it on my screen. There it is. It's just slow. Okay. Okay, so let's look at Lake E again. Lots of wiggles, but just bear with me. I'm going to walk you through it so you can understand what they mean. Here is our entire record up here. Now this goes to 2.8 million years ago. We just published this summer in Science. And each of these columns here, where I've put the big numbers, are the different warm interglacials. Again, the warm times in the past. And we want to compare how is one warm interval, like today, compare to the past. This is our parameter of the July temperatures. This is our parameter for the mean annual precipitation. So if we look here, this right here is the Holocene, the last 20,000 years. And you can see it was cold, and then it got kind of, this line here is today. And we see the measure of precipitation. If we go back 125,000 years ago, in our lake record, we get something that's a little warmer than today, and a little bit wetter, but not much. But stage 11, stage 31, much warmer, much wetter than we'd ever seen before. No, this was totally a surprise to us, and was quite exciting because we had the link with Antarctica here with stage 31, and it turns out Andrill may have missed stage 31. So they're back looking for it now because it's very possible there's an erosional unconformity in their record at that period. So we'll have to see. So what does this mean? If we just, again, look at this record and we think about the fact that during 5E, 125,000 years ago, during this time period, many people, and I just pick one, as those of you familiar with this know there's probably at least 10 different reconstructions for what Greenland looked like 125,000 years ago. So I just picked this one. So if we think about it, if in 5e Greenland was something like this, what was it like during these other warm periods? And the interesting thing about stage 11 is stage 11 was not, stage 11 here, it wasn't just 10,000 years. It was 25,000 years long. It was a very long, warm interglacial. So was that the whole story? No, it turns out this happened a lot in the Arctic. In fact, what we've identified is a whole number of time periods when we get very laminated sediments that are telling us that there are these super interglacials, these extremely warm times in the past. And what's interesting is that we cannot get those reconstructed properly with our models. And we say that actually in the science paper. We cannot use everything we know about the climate system. We cannot explain these exactly. So they need to be tested. We need to seek additional records. Nevertheless, that doesn't stop us from correlating what we've done with, again, back to Antarctica, to the Andril record. So down here is the Andril lithology. And just every time you see yellow, think no West Antarctic ice sheet. The West Antarctic ice sheet's gone. So all these yellow areas, there's no West Antarctic ice sheet. This record, in and of itself, was a surprise to learn that the West Antarctic ice sheet was that vulnerable to coming and going. But when you add to that the fact that this record, these red periods here, these little red boxes, are periods in our record, going back to this one to 2.8 million, show times when it was also warm in the Arctic. Now, because there are unconformities, in other words, erosional areas, within the Andril record, we can't match these one for one. We know this one matches. But it's interesting to note that the clustering of these times are also the correspond with the clustering of the record that we have in the Arctic. So it makes, so if we can get our age models a little better, we may actually be able to secure the match we have here with these other time periods. But it looks like when we lose the West Antarctic ice sheet, we get warmth in the Arctic half a precession cycle later. So let's go on to look at this time period now, just on a longer time scale. This is a pollen record, and again, pollen records, with all due respect to people who work with pollen, they're ugly. So I've made the colors just color schemed it here. So this goes from 3.6 million to 2.6 million years. The biggest change in here is that right at about 2.7 million years ago, we see a major change from forest to mainly tundra. You know, like I take the glasses off, and the fuzzy story here is mainly forest, mainly tundra, with a big change happening at 2.7 million years ago. And so we can think about what was that like? Mainly forest, mainly tundra in general. But it's not exactly that simple. Now, what else happened in the world at 2.7 million? Well, several people, and in fact, there was a paper written about a month ago updating this story. There's several people who have argued that going back over the last 5 million years, a major change at 2.7 million happened in the North Pacific, that the North Pacific became stratified, and the change in the thermal stratification and ocean atmosphere circulation interactions had a major change on the northern hemisphere. And so they have proposed for many years that northern hemisphere glaciation started at 2.7 million. That just, it started at that point. So is that true? Can we test that? So, but let's think about what was the Arctic like before 3 million years ago? Is this an Arctic you recognize? Some things are familiar, some things are not. What you should notice is if we go back at least 3 million years ago, there was no Hudson's Bay. There were no inner island channels. This was a large contiguous landmass. And if you have an increase in continentality, it's pretty easy to increase July temperatures, increase the temperatures to the north. So part of the reason we may have had forests so far to the north is we didn't have any inner island channels. And it turns out that a lot of climate models these days can't work at that resolution. They don't see the channels. So they can't model a before and after. So we've got to increase the resolution to be able to see that record. And if we look across that landscape, it turns out that and these are just a few, there's many, many places around the Arctic that date back to 3 million years ago when there were trees. There are huge, like I said, up in here, in this area, there's a record just recently published. Mean annual temperature at this site at 3.5 million years ago is 0, right? Like Anchorage, Alaska. So it's 19 degrees warmer than present back at this time. How do you explain all these warm sites? So here we are, Lake E over here. So we're not just an oddball here. We're actually able to take a lot of these sites, individual sites, and line them up with the record that we have here. So just a couple more points I want to make. This is a bit fuzzy, and it's on purpose because I haven't published it yet. I'm preparing this to be submitted hopefully in the next 2 weeks, or my colleagues will have my neck. But this is a record that goes from 2.2 million back to 3.6 million. So it's the Pliocene, the warm period. How warm was it in the past? And there's just a couple things I want to make, points I want to make with you about this. First of all, that if we look here, we see here is this, if you look at this green line, the green line going along that's a little fuzzy with the error bars, that's our July temperature. The black line here that you can see, that's the temperature of this site at 9,000 years ago, or in the early Holocene, when the Arctic was slightly warmer than present due to changes in the Earth's orbit. So what it's showing you is that throughout most of the Pliocene, only after 2.5 million did we even start to get a few times when it was cold, like 20,000 years ago. Only a few times, briefly, that the Arctic was in fact very warm much later than we thought. Not only that, we see a major change, very high precipitation, very wet, rainy seasons until about 2.9. Then after that, something causes it to shut down. We don't understand what that is yet. I'm yet to figure that out, and I'm not sure I'm going to figure it out in 2 weeks either. But anyway, very remarkable change in here. So if we zoom in on part of that record, here's that green. This is, again, July temperatures, and this is the Holocene maximum temperature here. You see the little dips below that don't happen until well after 2.5 million. And that's when we lose the trees. We start to lose trees, and we go mainly to tundra after that. And it's interesting, if you look here, this is the carbon dioxide reconstruction. This world, through this time, from 3.6 to 2.2 million, this carbon dioxide estimates, even if they're a big range, kind of fuzzy like this, they're still in the range of 400 ppm down to 340 ppm. It's a warm world. So our vegetation seems to be consistent with the PCO2. And I'll just go through this. Also, this is a global sea level record, this pink thing. This shows you the fact that the pink is very small in amplitude. Sea level isn't doing much. The glaciers aren't changing very much. But once you get after it's about 3.5 million, this is only 70 meters of sea level. So somewhere on Earth, there's only about 70 meters, but certainly nothing very big. So that means, well, when did Northern Hemisphere glaciation start? What and how big was it? Let's look at some evidence here. This is some modeling done by Sebastian Koenig, who's doing some vegetation modeling and coupled with ice sheets. And he did a couple experiments here. This one is a warm Pliocene orbit with carbon dioxide at 200 parts per mil. And this is a cold orbit at 200 parts per mil. And what you see is that if at 200 parts per mil CO2, you get a huge difference. You get tundra or you get warm vegetation in a warm or cold orbit. If you go back, though, in the Pliocene, or at least go back into at 200 or 400 parts per mil CO2, which is what Pagani is saying the world was like in the Arctic, it turns out whether you're in a cold orbit or a warm orbit, you can still keep trees at Lake Elgagikkan, and that's exactly what our pollen record shows us. That at 400 parts per mil, the pollen record it can explain our record, that we don't see the tundra coming in. So we see this amazing correspondence. Here's again the blue here is that marine isotopic record, and the red is the July temperature from our lake record. So we can see that there is, the Earth system is acting together, and this lake is picking up this temperature. But we also see these gradual changes over time from 3.6 million to when we finally get full-blown tundra during warm interglacials. So let me go on here. I'm going to skip just a few slides and go on to, again, talk about what was happening with Greenland. Because this is also a real interesting focus of a lot of research that's going on, people doing field work. What was going on with the early history of Greenland? So what Sebastian was trying to do here was also to look at not only what's going on in Lake Elgagikkan, but what was going on with Greenland. And what he did was, again, ran an interactive model which, in a warm orbit, shows you no Greenland ice sheet here. Of course, you haven't started it here. Again, this is using Pliocene orbital parameters, not recent. In a cold orbit, however, at 200 ppm, you can grow a sizable Greenland ice sheet at that time. Is either this one. The difference here is whether you have interactive vegetation or not, and I can go into that in the questions if you want to. But the other point here is if you use the 400 parts per mil, which is Pagani's estimate, it's consistent with our pollen record, in a warm orbit, there is certainly no Greenland ice sheet sitting there. Now, if those of you know, there are marine geologists out here who know there's ice-rafted debris all through there. So they will go, hey, wait a minute, there had to be some kind of ice sheet. And it turns out you can probably put ice along the eastern seaboard here and keep everybody happy. Just keep a little bit of tidewater glaciers going out, producing some tidewater glacier. But even at 400 parts per mil, you don't grow much of a Greenland ice sheet at that time. Now, the reason this is a wedge and not the whole Arctic is there's no ice building up anywhere else. So there's you're not building up a northern hemisphere ice at that time. So in the past, I think some of the major events here are probably coming from Antarctica, and what we want to do is put together some kind of composite record that links what's going on with the glacial transitions over time with global sea level, with what's happening in Antarctica, with the coming and goings of the Western Antarctic ice sheet, and couple these two Arctic and Antarctic records over time, and then link those with certainly low latitude records to try to understand what was this climate transition like. Everything didn't start at 2.7 million, like some people have suggested in the literature. In fact, I think that going from a forested Arctic into a tundra Arctic is much, much more complicated than we thought. And the nice thing is we think that certainly the Elgagikkan record is really going to open our eyes about that transition. So let me summarize here. Is this record has a lot of surprises. What we've learned is that the Arctic was, in fact, due to orbital parameters and feedbacks, was warmer in the past than we understood. A lot of these warmer intervals were driven by higher CO2. And again, we need to get better parameters for measuring CO2 prior to the Epoca ice core time period. And that the warmth in the Pliocene was certainly gradually punctuated by cold intervals, but they really didn't start till well after 2.5 million, and may have even not started until we don't really get full-blown what we call glacial-looking sediments until after even 1.8 million at the lake. So the history of the onset of glaciation and how that system operated, I think we still have a lot to learn there, and I'm hoping we can contribute to those arguments. One final note for the grad students, postdocs in this room: take risks. Don't worry about somebody saying, hey, that'll never work. If you got a good idea, follow your gut. Always have a plan B and a plan C, maybe a plan D. Don't give up. Take advice. I had to do that. And just remember, sometimes the road to success doesn't have a road. Thank you.
Questions?
Yes, Meredith.
Hey, Julie, it's so awesome to hear you talk about this record.
Thanks.
Amazing. But I guess my question is your primary way to reconstruct temperature and precipitation pollen? And it seems like that from the records, but have you tried any of the organic molecules to reconstruct?
Yeah.
Tried temperatures that way or tried other things?
We have, and I couldn't pack that in. Isla Castaneda has just joined our faculty a few years ago, and in the short time that she's been with us, we've already generating the GDDT records, these various indices, and so we have a really remarkable record that looks wonderful, low resolution because it takes so much sediment to do it, but it looks really good. If she's working, we've got a really good record back to stage 7. We have a paper submitted to Climate of the Past. It's out for review now, and it covers from isotope stage 8 to 12. And if we can get enough grad students to work on the material, we'd like to do the entire interval of time, but it's looking very promising. The other thing that I didn't get a chance to mention is that one of my PhD students extracted, at least for the last 140,000 years, she extracted the wax lipids and then did deuterium isotopes on the leaf wax lipids. And it looks amazingly like Vostok, which is bonkers. But the deuterium records between Greenland and Vostok, so we're trying to understand exactly what that is. She will have a paper hopefully submitted soon in the next couple of months on that. So we are pursuing all of the new biogeochemical toys that we can apply to the record. Yeah? We use the paleomagnetic time scale. In the very early part, we use radiocarbon dating, which is kind of messy because of old organics in there. But we use primarily the paleomagnetic record, first off. And then we had what we call event stratigraphy, where we have key points, like, for example, the last interglacial with the very warm pollen really sticks out. So if you put a label on that, so we have some tie points along the way. Those are secondary tie points. And then we actually used the tuning to do that. If you look at the record tuned and untuned, they're really remarkably similar. So when I say tuning, it doesn't mean we really messed it up. It actually was very little change in that. I should mention there are 8 tephras, volcanic ashes, in the lake record. And the good thing is there's 8 ashes. The bad thing is they're having trouble dating them. The chemistry of these ashes indicates that they're all from Kamchatka. They're all younger than 2.8 million. And they're just the chemistry isn't lending itself to argon-argon dating. So John Westgate in Canada is trying to do some fission track dating on those just to see if we can figure out what they are.
I had a question about dating, if I may. You speak of the average July temperature, and then earlier you said something about 5 centimeters of sediment per 1,000 year, which comes out to about 50 micron per year. How do you resolve?
Oh yeah, this record, we're looking at with climate, we're looking at averages, and in fact, when you take a centimeter of sediment in many of this is, you're looking at 150 years averaged. Yeah, that's kind of the only thing you have to sacrifice when you're working with paleo data.
How do you extract from that July average temperature?
You take the modern environment as your analog for how the temperature preferences of different assemblages of plants of various kinds, trees and all kinds. And then you take that assemblage and you look for the nearest modern analog, and then you apply that temperature and that precipitation regime to that level in the core. It's pretty standard in paleo studies to use this modern analog technique.
The second question I had, if I may again, is that pollen can travel quite far.
Yes. Yes. So the way the pollen scientists, pollinologists do this, is this technique requires that you have essentially an idea of the modern pollen rain. So you, for example, on Baffin Island, if you get 10% betula in your record, okay, that's coming up from the south. But if you get 30 or 40% betula, it's got to be there. So the pollinologists have a good idea of how much of the more southerly pollen is actually could be windblown versus how much means there's trees. What's interesting is larch pollen, larch trees, when they drop their pollen, it drops. It doesn't go anywhere. So if you've got larch pollen, you've got larch right there. So there's certain vegetation types that give us that kind of index. I saw a hand over here. Yeah, Laura.
That hue record that you have is pretty amazing how it lines up with the WIT.
Yeah.
Talk about what you think the changes in hue.
Next spring I'll have a better answer if Jeremy's done, because turns out the pigments are all degraded. We were looking for chlorophyll pigments that might be an index. They're too degraded in the older materials, so that's not going to work. So what he's doing is taking all the different wavelengths and trying to see, is there clay mineralogy, bulk mineralogy? Is it something to do with the actual stratigraphy? We have a little more oxidation in some of these warmer events that are redder. So red seems to be holding up. So exactly what's controlling it is not particularly clear. Hue is a combination of different wavelengths. So that's what he's trying to figure out. So I can't answer that entirely, but he wants to defend by June, so we'll have an answer. But it's amazing. We just couldn't figure it out. We just couldn't believe it. Yeah.
The uninformed mind like mine tries to grasp the correlation between atmospheric CO2 and organic bioburden on the crust. Is there any tie between those two? Does CO2 go down as biospecies go up to incorporate it?
Well, in our lake record, we tend to see when it's warmer, you get more organic matter. You've got more productivity in the lake and in the lake basin itself. So generally, we associate higher CO2 levels with warmer intervals, and lower with colder intervals. In general, so there's, if you're going into a cold environment and you've got just tundra on the landscape, you're not producing the amount of organic matter that could then wash into the lake as you could during a warmer time when there's more productivity. The other thing that adds into that is when you have permafrost and when you don't. And so that's one of the other things is we'd like to, most people would argue that certainly by 2 million years ago, we pretty much had permafrost everywhere, but before that, maybe not. So that's another thing we'd like to get at, because that impacts the delivery of all these different elements. Yeah, I'm sorry.
So just touching on the permafrost, you mentioned the permafrost core that you took on the edge of the lake. Have you seen any experiences?
Yeah, there was this hope that it would. First of all, we didn't know what was underneath the alluvial fans. These alluvial fans coming out, we weren't sure whether they're just more alluvial fans or whether they're lake sediments under there. That was a question. And we couldn't do it geophysically with ground penetrating radar or anything because of limitations of what we could take to Russia. And so we drilled this thinking, well, we'll learn what's down there. Maybe we're going to hit bedrock in 10 meters. Who knew? So we went down 141 meters, only alluvial fan material. So then the question was, what's the isotopic value of the water, of the ice in there? And one hope was that maybe there would be some evolution through time. Well, it turns out that probably the talic, the warm area around the lake, fluctuated this way. All right? So when it's warmer, the talic was larger. So the isotopic record in that 140 meters is absolutely boring, because it just matches the last time the lake water, pore waters, penetrating into the soil and back. And the core was taken literally about 100 meters from the lake shore. So it didn't give us the results that we wanted to. So we were the permafrost scientists were a bit disappointed with that.
I invite anyone with more questions to speak with Julie. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.